So now we're on to the Empire. If anybody is getting the song from Star Wars through their head right now, they should just stop. So, at the Empire, starting with one of the most important things that happened in the Empire was in 80 AD, the Colosseum is built in Rome. That was built by the Emperor Flavius. He actually built it because people were getting really pissed off at him, and he was assuming that he would be assassinated. So he built this amphitheater, this Colosseum, to attempt to keep everybody happy. It worked, apparently, because he died of natural causes before it was finished, and his son picked it up, probably thinking, well, it worked for Dad. Right? So that was built, and that can house somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000 people or more. It's an amazing, humongous building. Most of it still there today, and actually sometimes they even still use it. Take a look if you get a chance to look at the underneath the picture of it. I might have some on D2L, but if I don't, go search the web for it. Look at the underneath and inner workings of that. It's amazing. By about 354 AD, so a little over 300 years after the Empire began, well, closer to 400 years after the Empire actually began, you start to see we have about 100 days now set aside for theatrical performances. That's almost a third of the year set aside for theatrical performances. Now I said, oh, but yet no new plays were written for performance. I didn't say plays, I said theatrical performances. We're talking mime, pantomime, things like that. And of course they would consider a lot of the other things they do, the more bloodthirsty things, as theatrical performances. So, the most notable playwright of the era, we're getting into playwrights now on your list, so it would be on the second column over here, column B, Playwrights of the Republic. We talked about Livius Andronicus and Gnaeus Naevius. Now, Titus Macius Plautus is the name of Plautus. He's the comic writer. Let me run through these again really quickly here for you. Livius Andronicus, Roman literature considered to have begun with him, and he translated the first literary works in Latin. Gnaeus Naevius, the first native-born playwright, and introduced the national drama. All right, then we get to Plautus, Titus Macius Plautus, right? One of the greatest comic writers, really well known for the Menechmi, which you're going to read. Now, Publius Terentius Afer, that's the one that we call Terence. I would probably change my name to Terence too if my first name was Publius. But regardless, he was actually a slave, a Carthaginian slave, educated and then freed, and he became a playwright. So he's also one of the best comic writers alongside of Plautus. We have Pomponius and Novius, which we also discussed. They credited with making the Italian farce literary, which is where we get all of the stock characters from that then become Commedia dell'arte, the braggart, the comic old man, so on and so forth. All right. But then we get into the Empire, and the only one we have in the Empire is Seneca. And Seneca is probably, he was actually a tutor of Nero, not something I'd put on a resume, mind you. And only his tragedies survive today. We don't know if he wrote any comedies at all. None of them were supposedly produced. They were just given literary readings, although there are vase paintings of some of his works. So it's possible that they might have been produced, but not certain. Women were allowed at this time in pantomime and mime, as I said earlier, and they appeared half naked. And that was one of the aspects about mime that really connects to the cruelty of Rome. There was a lot of blood in these things, actual killings, actual attacks. They were very, very bloodthirsty. The women that did appear in them were considered shameless, had very bad reputations. And there was so much violence in there. This is where we get a lot of the slapstick, kicking, earboxing, things like that, is from this stuff. But it was a lot more violent back then than the slapstick later becomes in Commedia dell'arte. So looking at other entertainments in Rome now, on your list here, one we have is Gladiators. Now, okay, everybody says, well, Gladiators is two slaves, they fight to the death, and that's Gladiators. Okay, not necessarily, okay? First of all, yes, slaves were gladiators. Yes, captured prisoners during war were gladiators. And they only fought a couple of times a year. When you consider the fact of the damage that they took, they didn't die, because they didn't always die, right? The emperor or the crowd could decide that they were going to live if they fought well, fought bravely. So if you survived it, you probably took enough damage to where you're going to have to heal. Medicine this time, not as good as our medicine, so you have to deal with some healing time. So they didn't fight every day. They fought a couple of times a year. Some of them became so famous and actually fairly wealthy that sooner or later actual citizens began to sign up to become gladiators. Actually, one of the emperors became a gladiator. And he fought several, like over 100 gladiator fights. Now think about it for a second. I said a couple of times a year. Well, this guy fought a lot more than a couple of times a year, but I think it's probably feasible. When you consider that you're the emperor, who's going to actually hit you? You're probably not dealing with a lot of damage from these gladiatorial fights. So therefore, he can fight 100 or more times in his lifetime. So that's what gladiatorial contests are. Putting people in and fighting, not always to the death. The first one, it was for these types of battles that amphitheaters are built. The first one was in Pompeii at 75 BC. Yes, I'm still drinking my Italian beer for your amusement. Okay, the next one is Venetianese. The first one was in the Circus Maximus in 186 BC, and then they started moving them to the Colosseum in 80 AD. These are wild animal fights. Now, what they would do is they would either take, whenever the places they conquer, Africa, India, they would take things. Oh, we'll get an elephant from India, and we'll get a crocodile from Africa. We'll let them go at it and see who wins. That kind of thing. But they also put people in there as well. This is where this would be the type of entertainment where you would get the Christians throwing to the lions type thing, right? That's what they're talking. These are the wild animal fights. They were actually pretty cool also, especially in the Colosseum. One of the things that they did was they would actually, out of the bowels of the Colosseum, they would raise up through trapdoors things like trees, mountains, big, huge boulders, all this kind of stuff like that. They'd create this incredible topography, and they would send in half a dozen gladiators or so and a bunch of wild animals, and they would actually make them hunt. Now, when you think about this, you're sitting up on a raised advantage, so you're looking down on all of on the hunt. You can see the person sort of crouching and trying to stealthily get up to this animal, and you can see what's happening, and the animal knows it or doesn't know it or whatever. So it's a really interesting sort of a intense kind of entertainment. Not that I don't think it's necessarily a cruel type thing, because hell, I think it was Nero on his coronation, there were some 50,000 animals killed during that for their entertainment and amusement. So Peter would probably be pissed, but nonetheless, this is one of the ones they did. The last one you see on there is Naumachia. Now, the first one was created by Caesar in 46 BC. He had a man-made lake created for this. And then after that, they moved them into the amphitheaters, which they had created so that they could be sealed and flood that sort of orchestra area. And they're just ship battles. They would put people on either sides in boats on other sides of the lake or in the flooded amphitheater, and just have them go at it and fight to the death. So really, really bizarre, sort of interesting concept, but that was entertainment for them at that point in time. And now we move on to architecture on your list here. Okay. First thing you have in there is Etruscan stages. Now, these were the stages that were brought by the Etrurian dancers. So they're, again, just sort of makeshift platforms, sort of temporary staging areas. And these were imported and brought in, and they later became the basis for the Philiaic stages. Same kind of idea. You have a platform. If you can imagine this, you've got a platform here, and in front of it you now have steps leading up to it, and on the back of it you have a background, so which it would be effectively like the skene in the Greeks, but this is now a skene France. That's their name for their backdrop that they act in front of. That later becomes the building itself that they act in front of in their architecture, known as the Stoa, S-T-O-A, which is the entire building where the actors can go back and utilize for like a green room or several green rooms or storage and so on and so forth. Okay. Again, you also see here 75 BC Odeum, same kind of concept as it was in the Greeks. A square area, seats about 1,500 people, a rooftop held up by pillars, and it's really just there for musical recitations and so on and so forth. 55 BC, we see the first permanent theater. Now, up till then, any theaters that might have been built for a specific thing were temporary. They were built and then completely torn down. Some of them were actually really lavish, like various levels made of various, woods like mahogany and so on and so forth, and marble, and then they would just tear them all down. As we moved into the permanent theaters, those stairs that were in the Felix stages remained. So unlike the Greek theaters, which just had the staging area there and then the orchestra, the Romans actually had steps that led up to it. So from the orchestra, you could come up onto stage and be involved with it there. So that is the basic permanent structure there. There weren't too many permanent structures overall. And around 27 BC, they have a remodeling of the few that were made. There was 3 or 4 theaters that were made at that point in time. And in 13 BC and 11 BC, we see 2 more permanent theater structures in Rome. Outside of that, they're utilizing the Greeks that are out there or any permanent theater structures of places that they conquered. And then they're, of course, Romanizing them. Anything they come across, they end up sort of remodeling and Romanizing. You see on there it says comparison to Greek theaters. I'm not really going to go into that too in depth because it's not incredibly important. Now we're moving on to masks and costumes. Masks were linen. If you notice here, their costumes are very, very similar to Greeks. The only difference is pretty much the names. They have the exomis, which is a short tunic, so it's one that's not necessarily floor length. But this was also used actually in Greece, but for comic plays. They wouldn't use it for tragedy. The onkos is the same thing, oversized hairpiece. The pallium is the himation for women, the long cloak, and for men, excuse me. And the palla is the similar Greek himation for the women. The sokos is just like in Greeks, it's a slipper for comedy, as opposed to the big boot, which we also use in Roman theater for tragedy. Now, acting was really, really highly developed here, and on par of the level of training you would take to become a gladiator, you went through to become an actor. They trained them in gymnastics. They really forced them to learn various talents and skills, kind of like we do today, but actually to a much higher level. Initially, they were slaves, but again, just like gladiators, what ended up happening is they started seeing these slaves become actors and make money and get famous and be able to buy their freedom. And all of a sudden, people who had debt, regular citizens, so on and so forth, decided, well, I can do that. I'm going to go ahead and become an actor and become a star myself. And we still kind of see that today. All right. Now, we talked about mime and pantomime. Mime being done without masks, facial expression is very important, and there was some dialogue. Pantomime entering music and dance into it as well. So looking at the downfall, in 393 AD, an emperor by the name of Theodosius I decided that Christianity was the only acceptable religion in Rome. Now this would have been the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire is around where Constantinople was. And the Western Roman Empire now becomes Christian. At that particular point in time, a lot of these actors started to flee because the Christians did not accept their occupation as something that was acceptable. So many of them fled. Then in 398 AD, the Council of Carthage determined that anyone who went to a theatrical performance or did a theatrical performance, especially on a holy day, mainly on holy days, were going to be excommunicated. They were not permitted, actors were not permitted in sacraments of the church, which means they weren't allowed to be married or buried unless they forswore their profession. And that is how theater effectively ends in Rome. Now, by roughly 77 years afterwards, Western Roman Empire will fall. Once that happens, actors, writers, and everyone flee north, and we hit the medieval era. And we will talk about that more in the next video.